Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today I'm going to talk about how to arrange the results section in your thesis and how to choose the right graph or table format for your data, because students are often confused when it comes to choosing between a graph and a table for their data. So many students are not aware of it, that in what kind of situation you can choose a table for your data, and in what kind of situation you are going to present your data in the form of a graph. So here in this presentation, I will tell you all about the tables and graphs. Certain types of data can be presented in the form of a table, but not in the form of a graph. A graphical representation would not be suitable for that. So you must take great care. But before I discuss about the tables and graphs, I just want to tell you about certain cautions that you have to make when you are going to write your results. Because I have seen many students who are making these mistakes when they are describing their results. So the first thing that I have seen in many theses is that people are describing methods and results. The methods, material methods sections is a separate section in your thesis, and you have to describe the methods over there. Okay, so you don't have to describe the methods and results again. That is duplication, and that is not required, not needed. And it doesn't give a good impression if somebody is describing the methods again in the results sections. Results sections is only for the results that you got as a result of doing some kind of experiments. So do not describe methods in results. Do not discuss results in this section. You know, in our thesis format and in many different thesis formats, results and discussion are two separate sections. So you have to take great care while writing your results, not to discuss your results in this particular section, because there is a separate section for discussion of the results. Okay, so I will share a separate video response in order to describe how can you discuss your results, because that's also a pressing problem with our students. So I would also tell you the details of that. The third thing is, do not duplicate your results both in figures and tables. I have seen this particular thing in the case of many theses, that I have reviewed, that people are describing results both in the form of a table, and the same results are described in the form of a figure. So it's a blunder, actually. It indicates that the investigator or the person who is writing that particular thesis is not aware about the fact that duplication in scientific publications in the form of thesis or manuscript or some other forms of presentations is not acceptable, and it doesn't give a good impression, and it indicates that the person has not adopted uh, the scientific methodology properly. So avoid duplication of results in the form of figures and tables. If you're making a table for results, you don't have to make a figure for the same results, because it doesn't make any sense to present your results in two different forms at the same time. Um, Another thing is that do not duplicate your entire results in tables and text. This is a very common mistake that students actually would make. Now, first they would make a table for the results, and after making the table, they would just pick each and every value out of the table and describe it in a text that, uh, the overall prevalence was this, and in the case of this particular thing, the gender or the age groups or everything that they have written in the table, they would just describe these things in the text. So it doesn't make any sense again, because if you are making a table for your data, it means that you are making it visible to the people. It should be self-explanatory, and you don't have to describe each and everything that you have given in the table uh, down there in the text. Okay, so that is a very common mistake, and it doesn't give a good impression as well. It indicates that somebody is not very well versed with scientific writing. So you have to develop your writing skills in order to do that. And only you can describe only significant results in the text, uh, if you have done some statistical analysis or something very striking that is there in the table that implies something, that particular results can be described in the text, but not your entire table as a text. Okay, then you have to give a flow to your results by first describing the whole and then the parts in a sequence. Okay, if you have done some experiment, for instance, okay, it's some kind of prevalence that you have figured out in some particular setting in a city or in a province, for instance, then you describe your results, for instance, as a whole, in the entire province or the entire city, and then you describe the results in a sequence, in parts. You describe your results in the case of different genders, then in the case of different age groups, in the case of different localities. So you can, you just have to make a flow that somebody is just descending down and going somewhere, you know and that would make your story understandable for others. If there is no sequence in the results, again, it doesn't leave a very good impression uh, on the part of the writer or the author of that particular thesis. When to use tables? It's a good question. When to use tables? Many students think that they can use tables everywhere, for any kind of data that they have. You know, that's what they are learning in many cases. That because they are uh, seeing these tables everywhere in different manuscripts and on on different media. That's why they naturally think that tables are a good representation for each and every kind of data, but it is not so. You cannot use tables for all types of data that you have. Okay, it's very much important to know where can the table be used actually for what kind of data. Tables work best when the data presentation is used to look up individual values, for instance. Okay, if you're looking up for individual values, then you can put your data in the form of a table, and that would show you individual values, and that would make your the job of the reader very easy to understand your data, those individual values that you have put over there. It is also used to compare individual values. Comparison is also, easy when you give your data as a table. So if you intend to compare different values in your experiments, again, the table can be a good options. Okay, but it requires precise values. You cannot, put your data. You have to round it up. The numbers that you have cannot be in decimals. That doesn't leave a good impression. You have to round up your data and then put these values in the tables, and that would make or increase the understanding of your data in the form of the tables. And when Sometimes the values, they involve multiple units of measures. You are using different things, uh, it involves different units, for instance, units of measurement or units of weight or time and different things. All these things cannot be put very easily in the form of a graph, a graphical representation. In that case would not be possible because you have so many different things, so many different units, values, with different measures. So that's why you have to go for the table. In that case, you can use tables to present your data. Now, a good table provides complete information, and many students are not well aware that a table, it has got a legend, and the legend in most of the cases is provided, but there is no footnote. And sometimes, the location of the legend is what the students actually don't know. They would, sometimes give it under the table or somewhere else in the text. So that's why you have to be very careful while, giving tables in your thesis. So for that purpose, you have to know different parts of the tables. This is the legend here. You have to number the table, give a legend. For instance, this is a table, and this legend is, giving this information about the table. What is it about? Okay. Then the legend is here about the table. There is a clarifying note here if you are giving data in the table. Sometimes you put some asterisk or some alphabet on a particular type of data that you give in the table. And in the footnote here, then you explain it, that clarify it, that what does it mean. For instance, in this case here, you can see A. So the A has been clarified as a footnote, that what is A here, what does it mean. Okay. And there should be lines of demarcation that separate numerical data from the text. These are lines of demarcation, about it. You can provide the grid lines or whatever, but these elements are essential elements. The legend, the footnote, if there is something that you want to explain, even the terms that you use here or the units that you are using here can be explained here as a footnote uh, of this particular table. And you can see there are different types of measurements in this particular thing. That's why table is a suitable representation for this kind of data. Okay, what about the figures? If you are using figures in your thesis, uh, there could be different types of figures like paintings, photographs, drawings, flowcharts, line graphs, bar graphs, pie charts, or maps. That depends upon your requirement, the requirement of your thesis, that what kind of figures are going to be used here. Again, just like it's the same case with the figures as it was with the tables when we were discussing tables, that you cannot use figures for each and every kind of data. You have to be very uh, you know you have to be sure about the data presentation, that whether it looks good or understandable. It is understandable if you represent it as a figure and not as a table. Okay. And what different kind of things that we discussed in the tables, that sometimes certain kind of data may not be suitable to be presented in the form of a table, can be represented in the form of different graphs. A graphical representation is suitable. Data cannot be put in a table or adds more value as a graphic. If it is more understandable as a graph, then you go for a graph. If it cannot be put in a table properly, then you can use a graph. A graphical representation is suitable. It's useful for portraying trends. relationships and comparisons. Okay, if you are going to show a trend in your data that a certain infection is increasing in particular months or in particular seasons, and you want to show the trend, so that trend can be shown in a better way if you use these graphical representation rather than the tabulated form of the data, that you give different months and the percentages of infections in case of different pathogens. So that would not be very much understandable for the reader. If you just put it as a graph, for instance, a line graph, it can show you a trend that it's increasing or decreasing, and that would be very easy for you and the reader. And if you want to, show some relationship or compare different things, increase and decrease in different things, again, graphical representation would be suitable in that case. Okay, so there are different types of, graphs. Common types of graphs that people use is a bar chart, which is used for comparison of absolute values of several discrete samples. If you have a number of samples, and you want to show their relationship, you use their values and make a bar graph or a bar chart for that. So it's suitable for this also. Then there is a histogram, which is a description of a single continuous sample. Okay, if you are taking a single continuous sample and you are finding out relationship of different parameters, then again you can use a histogram. This is particular, a histogram. You can use a pie chart, comparison of relative values of several related samples if you want to compare relative values of a particular, samples. Then you can also use a pie chart or a scatter plot, which is used for association between two quantitative variables. If you are going to associate two quantitative variables, one along x-axis and the other along y-axis, then you can use this scatter plot for that kind of relationship. So there are many different types of graphs, but these are common. And if you label different parts of the graph, you should know that the key to the sample symbols is provided here. This is the y-axis that you see here, and the y-axis label is here. You have to provide this particular label that uh, whatever your variable is, you have to give it here. Then you have to give your independent variable, for instance, in this case is time, along x-axis, and you have to define other terms uh, as well. Okay, the major ticks and the minor ticks and the origin, it should start with 0. This is very important. Okay, and you have to provide the legend. This is figure 1 and this is the legend. This particular uh, figure 1 is described here as a legend. That what does it mean? So you have to provide all these different things, your data and things on the x-axis and y-axis, and all these things should be there when you are presenting your data in the form of a graph. So a bar graph, okay. What is the bar graph used for? It compares values across categories of treatments, you know. For instance, this particular experiment that I have, uh, you know, uh, taken from the internet, uh, the total number of insects per plant density. There are, two types of plant densities, three types of plant density. One is control, one is medium, and the one plant density is high. Okay. So along x-axis, the independent variable is plant density. You know about the dependent and independent variable. Independent variable whose variation does not depend, on other. things, that is called independent variable. So independent variable is usually denoted by x. So it is along the x-axis. Here the plant density is the independent variable, you know and this is the insect number of insects per plant, which is the dependent variable. The dependent variable is what is measured or what is studied is the dependent variable. Okay, dependent variable is something that is being measured or studied. Okay, independent variable is not being measured or studied. It is not a variation of these whose variation would not depend on the other variable, this one. Okay, so this is an independent variable is along the x-axis, independent variables along the y-axis. Okay, and values of a bar graph, it could be a raw data, it could be totals of your samples, or other things, their means. You can use all these different types of data to present your data as a form in the form of a bar graph. Okay, and the length here is important. It is showing you the number of insects that in the case of uh, you know uh, the high density, where the plant density is high, the insect number is also high. So it comes down along the plant density. And here is control. In the case of control, you compare these values along with control, and then you figure out that how the number of insects would be correlated with the plant density. So it's a good way to represent this kind of data in the form of a bar graph. Okay, if you have two data sets on one bar graph, again, uh, you know, you can determine the number of insects in the case of these three plant densities: high, medium, and control. So you can again, use the mean values or the total that you have. That's what I told you, that you can use the means, the total, or your raw data, whatever you have is a bar graph, and that can give you meaningful information. It's very easy to understand when you look at the graph. Okay, you can also provide your graph with standard deviation on bar graph, and many people are doing it. And this error bars, these are called error bars that you see here. Error bars are graphical representations of the variability of data, um, and are used to indicate error or uncertainty in the measurement. So this is actually telling you about uncertainty in these samples. It's very important to give this value. And these bars, for instance, error bars are representing one standard deviation or one standard error, you know, or a particular confidence interval, like 95% confidence interval or 90% confidence interval, in the case of these three plant densities and the insect numbers. Okay, so whenever you do experiments, there are variations in the samples size. So that's why you have to indicate the errors, the margin of error, or the standard deviation which is there in your samples, and that makes even easier for the reader to understand whether your data is valuable, authentic, it can be relied upon or not. Now you have to make the right choice for data. For instance, this is one type of data in two different graphs, costs versus revenue. Okay, for the year 2004, this This poor graph choice on the left versus an effective choice on the right can be seen here. So if you are plotting cost versus revenue, that your revenue and cost comparisons in different months of the year, in this graph you can see it's uh, in this graph, it's not very understandable for the reader to see the comparison of the cost and the revenue. These are, the colors indicating operating cost. The green is the revenue. So it's not very much understandable for the reader. But if you look here, the revenue versus cost, operating cost, which has been represented in the form of a bar graph, it's very easy to figure out that in January the operating cost was more, in February it was less, in March it was less than the revenue. Similarly, in April it was less than the revenue. Similar is the case with May. So you can, just by looking at the bar graph, you can uh, easily tell about the operating cost and the revenue relationship in these particular months. So it's very easy to understand here in this form, but not in this form. Similarly, if you want to plot the 2004 year, expenses, and you have different heads like sales, information system, etc. So if you are just using this line graph here to represent this relationship for different departments, for instance, here in the given on the x-axis, and these are the expenses on the y-axis. So it would not be easier for the reader to figure out engineering, finance, or human resources, information, etc. by looking at this graph. But if you plot it like this, horizontal bars, then you can very easily understand, the relationship of the sales with the, uh, you know, uh, in the case of different departments. So it makes it easier to understand that sales, information system, engineering, they have, they are showing the trend here. Similarly, line graphs use only with continuous data. If you have continuous data, it can compare multiple continuous data sets and show trends. You are showing a sales trend, for instance, in different months, January, February, March, and April, that the sale is going up, coming down, going up, coming down, etc. Okay, so this is a continuous, data, and this trend, because you are looking for a trend in order to catch it in a second, that what actually happened over the months, over that particular period. So a line graph is best for the continuous data when you are going to show a trend. You can use the line data, even for showing the ups and downs in the case of different infections over a particular period of time or the different seasons. So that is the best choice for the graph. Now, if you look at here, the bar graph and the line graphs here, they are comparable. Sometimes you can use both the choices, but because in the case of these three, companies, Deluxe, Platinum, and Alpha, Deluxe, Alpha, and Platinum, you can see the relationship for 2004 and 2006. That what is the sales relationship of these in different years? Okay, 2004, 5, and 6. So you can use both of these line graphs and bar graphs here. But what if the chart had to show data for 20 models? Okay, if there were more models, then what kind of graph would be suitable for presentation of that particular data? So that I'll leave it to you to decide that if there were 20 models instead of these three, then what kind of a graph would have would you have chosen for your data presentation? So line graph of average numbers of flowers blooming over time. This is the line graph. It's showing you a particular relationship, and these are the color representing different species, 1, 2, and 3. It's showing a trend in data at equal intervals. Okay, so the trends, when you want to see trends in a data, always use line graphs for that particular data presentation. Right, as a pie chart is used to show the contribution of each item to the whole, and values are commonly given as a percent or a proportion. For instance, this is a pie chart, and most of the people would just grab a pie and, you know, use it in their thesis. But if you look at this relationship, these are, percentage of plant species in a habitat, shrubs, animals, trees, succulents, etc. If you just use a color scheme for it, for this particular pie, for instance, that green represents shrubs and blue for animals, etc., and you don't put these values, the percentage here, it would be very difficult for the reader to assess, you know, which percentage or which plant percentage is actually, you know, represented here. So sometimes this visualization fails if the decoding fails. Okay, if for some kind of data showing these proportion, the pie chart would serve the purpose, but not for all different types of data, because if the decoding is not right, then visualization would not be enough to figure out exact proportion in that case. Okay, so you don't have to use pi in no, all cases of data. Why not use a table? If you even use a table for this kind of data, for instance, you can very easily give your information. Okay, graphs are useful when a picture of the data makes meaningful relationships visible, like patterns or trends and exceptions. When the graphs would make them visible, a trend or something, or a pattern, okay, that could not be easily discerned from a table of the same data. Okay, but if you can easily understand the table, then the table probably is serving good, and you should use the table rather than going for the graph. Even better choice would be horizontal bar graph in this case. For instance, these are different companies, and this is the best choice because when you just look at it, you can figure it out that, you know, what is the percentage, of a total market share in the case of a particular company. So you are comparing different companies. So if you are making a bar, it will be difficult for the reader to understand it. But if you just the pie, talking about the pie, but if you are using these horizontal bars, it's become very easy to show this relationship and figure out in just in a fraction of a second that company B has more shares, about 40%. So that's the objective of your presentation, that people should know, should come to know about your significant results when they look at your figure, uh, the, uh, our table. Graphs may be misleading. In many cases, graphs can be misleading. For instance, this is an example from the internet. University of Kentucky published this particular thing, that the Times leaves the rest behind in print and online. The Times is a magazine, so this particular thing is showing that the Time magazine sales are have increased exponentially. And if you look at the right, it has represented, compared the time sales with Daily Telegraph, and clearly it indicates that the Times sales are almost double of this particular portion is compared to the Daily Telegraph, but this is misleading. If you look at the values here, 446954, and 485,720, then you would come to know that the difference between these two values is not more than 10%. Okay, so it's not a very significant, uh, difference between the two. That's why this kind of graph, it's misleading. It's showing you that almost the Times magazine sale is double that of the Daily Telegraph, but the actual things are, the values are not showing you that particular trend. So the bar here is a poor choice for this particular data. Here is another, graph, a misleading graph. It shows that over 100 million people in US now receiving some form of federal, welfare. So it's a graph which is clearly showing an upward trend here. That about more than 100 million people in the US are receiving some form of federal welfare. Okay, so it's if somebody looks at this graph, often people are using these graphs in the media for their popularity. So if you look at this graph, it's quite impressive. It has an upward trend, and it seems that 100 millions is a lot of number. But if you look at here, uh, it is the starting point. It's not zero, it's 94 million. So it's starting from 94 million and reaching up to 100 million. It's not starting from zero. If you started with zero, or any other number, the trend that the upward trend that you see here would not be the same. It would be different. So this is a misleading graph actually that people are using. Here is another misleading graph. For instance, this graph is showing unemployment rate, under President Obama in the US. Somebody put this graph in on the internet, and I have just, copied it. So if you look at this graph again, it's a line graph, and it's showing an upward trend here, and then it is coming downward here. Okay, so this is the line graph. And this is showing a clear upward trend here, slight downward here, and then stable. If you look at this graph, what is wrong with this graph, for instance? If you have to look at it, this graph, this is a Fox News, and in the news you can see, even in our country, you can see a lot of graphical data presentation, and people are using these tools. If you look at this graph, this is 8.6%, so it's not properly represented here. It's presented along with 9.0% or 9%. It's parallel to 9%. So there's no difference between 9 and 8.6%. If you just, if you put the right value for 8.9%, then this trend would come down here. Okay. And if you look at the entire data, you would see that unemployment rate is quite stable. It's about 9% overall. But this thing is showing you a trend. So it's not a true trend actually that is represented here in this case. And if you look at the starting point, it's about 8%. That's why some graphs can be misleading. They actually are not showing you the right trends, because for each kind of data there would be a different graph, or sometimes the graph would not serve the purpose, and you have to go for presentation of your data in the form of a table. So as a scientist, you should take care of these things, and there are certain recommendations for the figures that you should you should keep in mind. Read publishers' recommendations regarding size, color, and format. If you are publishing it for publications, uh, you should think whether the figure is needed or not. Can it be understood at a glance? When you just look at it, somebody would understand it. Limit the curves. 3 to 5 are bars, 6, 8, 9 to 10 grouped. You can group them. Plot independent variable on x-axis. For instance, the time or age, these are independent variables. They do not depend on the other variables. Rather, you are measuring other variables at different intervals of time or age. So these should be independent variables should be on the x-axis, while the dependent variable should be on the y-axis. And I told you about the dependent variables are those that you are going to measure or you are going to study. Avoid wasted space legend, on field. You can go on this site spreadsheets.about.com for tutorials on how to make different graphs. And you can use this program Visio for making diagrams. Many students ask that how can we make diagrams, different diagrams that you see in the literature. So those diagrams can be made by different software programs available on the internet, including this one, Visio. So thank you very much for today's, for listening to me. Hope that you would have gone through other videos on GTV Educations. You can subscribe the channel and find out more important or useful information for regarding thesis writing and other scientific issues. Thank you very much.